looking at presently and what is being forecast for January. So, and we have some heavy hitters that we've invited into the space. Kevin Gordon is well known throughout the state. If you've not heard him speak before, I'll just say, like, take notes, be ready. And then we also have Mike Simonson from the County Office of Education, Deputy Superintendent. Thrilled to have you with us as well. So these two are going to provide some simple content. This session will be recorded. We're live streaming, so people will be able to reference it after the fact, and then we'll come back together again in October for an opportunity to hear about Poway Unified specifically. Okay, so tonight is really, or this afternoon is really, school finance and what we see in Sacramento, and then our next meeting we'll do a deep dive. We'll do a deep dive into Poway Unified's budget, where we sit and what we're anticipating. And when we talk about a structural deficit, we'll talk about that as well. So that'll be the next time we're together. If we haven't met, I'm Greg Mizell, Interim Superintendent. I'm pretty familiar with most of you in the room, but if we haven't met, that's who I am and the role I presently serve in. We are joined in this audience right now by several school board members, so I want to make sure you guys give it up for Heather Plotsky, one of our trustees. I see Ginger Couvrette, one of our trustees, and I think it's just the two of them right now, so thank you both for joining us. They are here really just to listen, so, and really for all of us, right, a chance to listen and learn. So at the end of the slide deck, we'll have time for questions and answers, and maybe then we'll talk about kind of what we're anticipating for our next meeting. Does that sound good? Okay, Kelly Logan, I wanted to introduce you as well, PFT President. Thank you for being here. And I think that those are our VIPs, at least presently. So Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself, and we'll let you kick it off?
Yeah, I think I'm going to, well, do I need to use this for whoever's watching online? Is that?
I think
oh,
the
okay.
mic is always a good idea.
Okay, all right, I'll use it anyway. So, all right, it's great to be with you all. One of the things that I really appreciate, Greg, and the leadership of the district, you have no idea how infrequently this kind of a process is done. And one of the things that I've always thought over the years is that all of the stakeholders that are involved with budget process in a district, the more information we all have, the more competence we bring to whatever the problem is, the better off the whole district's going to be. Is that let's sort of kind of understand what the backdrop is first. And I think this is a part of that building block, is let's get some basic information from, and I do education advocacy. I've been fighting over school budgets to get more money for public education for my entire career. And the last couple of years have been actually pretty good years for us. But it was a real interesting education that we had to do for a lot of legislators this last budget cycle, including, by the way, the governor, who had never been in a position of leadership during a downturn in terms of the money that was coming into the state's general fund. So we kind of had to show them the way. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that so you can kind of see what the circumstances are. But the one thing that's important to note, I'm going to tell you a little bit what state finance is, what the potential opportunities might be, and what the threats might be at the state level, so we all kind of get that. But I also want to tell you that we passed a budget last June 15th, and by the legislature, and the governor signed it, that had virtually no cuts in it for K-12 education, despite the fact that and the governor ended up acknowledging a $55 billion hole in the budget. Now, K-14 education is about 40% of the overall general fund. So way back in January, when we knew the problem was really big, we were bracing for, oh my gosh, what's going to be our share of the overall drop in the budget? Because that's the way we were used to doing it for so long. But frankly, because of Proposition 98, which has been not very helpful for a couple of decades, provisions of that constitutional minimum guarantee for schools kicked in that protected us. And it's why we ended up getting a budget like that. But despite a budget that had flat funding at the state level, there were a bunch of things that we were trying to educate legislators about, that if they heard us still whining about our fiscal circumstances, there were reasons for it. And part of it led back to them, which is there are a lot of ways that they've helped us that they've sort of abandoned on mandatory expenditures they make school districts incur, but then they don't help us pay for it. And a classic example of that is on STRS and PERS. And we all want those retirement systems to be completely solvent, but they put the burden on funding the ramp up, the bigger investment in those two systems on districts, and said, oh, by the way, here's your bill to pay this. And in the first couple of years, we basically convinced them to help us. And then they just stopped. So that meant that the increased obligation in the succeeding years we didn't have. Then you layered into that, and there was a little bit of sympathy on this one, on the issue of declining enrollment and the impacts on ADA that we had that were with COVID related and then post-COVID related, is that's killing districts, and it's having its effect everywhere, including here. So there's a lot of these little ingredients that together create a situation where the majority of public school districts in California today are cutting their budgets. And even though we got flat funded in the state budget. So what we told legislators is what we want you to know when they said, hold on a second, we didn't cut you guys. What are you complaining about? We said, what you didn't do is make life worse for us. But it doesn't mean it isn't bad. And we got a lot of issues. And you could make things better. And there is some hope that things could get better later on. But sort of there's a long-standing budget expert that Mike and I both know, Ron Bennett, who's no longer with us, but used to always say, hope is not a plan, is that it's good for us to all know about kind of what's on the horizon, because we have very different circumstances this year than we had a year ago that was driving us into a hole. The opposite is starting to happen, which is that fortunately they adopted a budget where they lowered their expectations and were actually exceeding the revenue expectations. That could end up helping a little bit. It won't help us on systemic budget problems, but it will create some relief, I think. So let me just take a look at this. As there were some slides put together by the staff, and one of the things that we like to try to point out is when we talk about the big three is that there are major revenue sources that we watch that the state has that drives the health of the general fund of the state of California. And the reason why we talk about this is because it's connected to school finance. However good the state's general fund is doing impacts what we get in education, because our money is a formula that's predicated on the health of the general fund. When the general fund of the state of California is doing really good, then Prop 98 does really good. Prop 98 is our money. And the big three are the major tax sources. And so you have the biggest of them is personal income tax. Then you have sales tax, and then bank and corporation tax. So every month I'm looking at the numbers to say, what happened on those three? Did we exceed the number that was expected for this month? And have we exceeded the number that was expected year to date? I'm watching that every single month. I think you're watching that too, Mike. You know, you always pay attention to that. And you can see what's going on here. And that one of the things that we talk about that was sort of the contributing problem to the state was that where you see that big giant spike, people say, well, how bad is the budget and the economy compared to prior years? You can tell that it's not a sharp down. We're not dropping downward. What it means is that we had a spike that went up and we came back down to what is basically more normal. But that drop to normal after being on this great high, it has its implications, because obviously we budget and we think everything's great, but we're losing revenue, but it's dropping down to a place that's basically more closer to normal. And what we expect that little bright blue line to do when we look at what kind of revenues are coming in right now, and depending on what the economy does in the future, we would love that blue line to actually cross that black line maybe a little bit, or at least be even with it. We'd love that to happen, but we're going to have to wait and see. This helps define where the governor's budget proposal was in January, his revised proposal in May, and what the legislature ended up doing in terms of their budget act 1 year ago, and you can see the differences about where the governor's plan was, where we end up, and that's closer to what would end up getting adopted, the green line. A huge drop in overall revenue that contributed to that $55 billion overall problem that the state had and how they had to solve it. So this was the definition of the budget problem. Now you see 27.6 and you're hearing Kevin Gordon talk about 55. They actually took early action to solve some of the problem. And then they came back and did the rest of it. and cleaned up the rest of the budget, so they had a total of $55 billion worth of solutions, and they solved the overall budget. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this slide talks about those things that actually can be downside risks to the budget. And they're intuitive things that you can tell are going on. And one of the issues that the Fed has done is that they've had really high interest rates, but we've had high interest rates. I call it a self-inflicted wound, is that when Donald Trump and other people say, you know, inflation's still out of control, inflation is actually not out of control anymore. But one of the things that average folks don't like, because they conflate the terms inflation and high prices. Inflation is constantly growing prices, but once you kind of stop that from the growth that's growing out of control, have you ever seen anybody reverse the cost of something? No. You know, the businesses and the people that supply goods and services usually don't then lower the price of it. It is where it is, but at least we've arrested the increase. The inflation is the thing that's driving it up. So while, you know, the Biden administration and people will take credit for having gotten inflation under control, what stays high is the price of so many goods and services that people are complaining about. And I think they need to do a better job of just explaining the difference. And then you have our unemployment rate in California is only, we're tied with, I think, one other state, I can't remember which one it is, in the nation for the worst unemployment numbers in the country. Usually we're leading the country in some of these indexes. So our unemployment situation is not the envy of the rest of the country. So we've got issues there that we're trying to work on. And we're still close to full employment, but we do have a little bit of a problem compared to other states that are definitely doing better than us. You know, 48 of the other states are doing better than us. And then this sort of slow growth that I expect to be changed by a federal interest rate cut that I'm expecting probably within the next 30 days, like almost everybody else is, and maybe the potential of a second interest rate cut before the end of the year. If we do get those interest rate cuts, watch what happens to the growth in the state's general fund, because as I told you before, the biggest connectivity to growth for us on the school side is the health of the general fund, and the general fund's connected to personal income, is one of the big three, and it's the biggest of the big three. So we know what happens on the stock market, which translates into income, and it's in the personal income column. It will take off like crazy if we have really robust economic growth fueled by interest rate cuts. We'll see what happens with that. And then so this is sort of an overview. Let me just look at this. I'm gonna skip those other two slides to tell you that, and to come to Prop 98 and kind of have this not distract us, is that Prop 98, I like to do sort of the easy explanation of Proposition 98, which got written, my very first job in education advocacy, that year I got hired, they handed me this ballot measure and said, can you analyze that and tell us what position we ought to take on it? It was Prop 98. And I looked at it, and what it does is it puts into the Constitution, the education community put it on the ballot, and it puts into the Constitution that no year the legislature shall give us less than a minimum amount of support, so that we as an ed community don't have to constantly fight just to get sort of the minimum, like what it takes to fund a cost of living increase. That we at least start at that level, and then if we want to argue for more money from that, we actually have a floor that we can debate from. And I looked at the ballot measure and I thought, I think this is a funding cap. Because if you think about average politicians, they're going to say, well, what does the Constitution make us do? Okay, whatever that number is, write it down, and then let's move on. They've never, very rarely ever, given us more than that minimum. So the minimum becomes a maximum. So I wasn't wild about Prop 98. And most of the duration of Prop 98 that was passed in 1988, it really, if you go back and look at it, it's barely kept us even with inflation. It's not really been that much help. This past year, though, it was monumental how helpful it was to us, but it was almost an accident. And here's why. One of the fundamental sort of drivers of Prop 98 is the idea that wherever you leave off in one year becomes the starting point the next year. Well, what happened a year ago is, and what the governor discovered, is that they had to adopt a budget. They weren't sure how much revenue was going to come in, because remember they delayed the income tax filing from the springtime, April, all the way till November. When they did that, it was the first time in state history where they had to adopt a budget for the fiscal year without having any idea what revenue they had. So they made a guess at what we were entitled to, and they appropriated it to us, and we got it. So we spent all that money. We got all the way to the end of the fiscal year, and then they found out in November, oh my goodness, we don't have any money. The year, because it had closed, we were asserting to the legislature and the governor, that year's over. That high water mark is locked in. It is the beginning point next year. So the debate that we had several months this year at the beginning of the year with the governor and the legislature is you can't go back to a year that we've closed and reopen it to cut us to what we would have gotten, because the Constitution says, for the kind of formula that we were under, that whatever we got is a starting point, baby, for next year. So we made this argument, and what we did, the calculation, and we got a chance to meet with the governor, we said, here's your problem. You can be real generous and recognize you got a problem and tell us you want to hold us even and no cuts. But you actually owe us something between $17 and $22 billion more than what it costs to keep us even. That's under Prop 98. Said, but we're going to be nice guys about this, is you don't have the money. So what the governor was proposing were manipulations of the Constitution that were so egregious that in future years, they could basically define it as whatever they wanted to. So we were trying not to look too greedy, because the rest of the budget was going to get balanced, not on the education side. We were going to be good, plus they were going to owe us money. So what we pointed out to the governor and the legislature is that if you suspend Prop 98, you vote to suspend Prop 98, set it aside, you hold us flat funded, and it automatically creates, it's part of the constitutional language, it creates an OZs to get us back to where we otherwise would have been if you didn't suspend that $17 to $22 billion. There's a part of that that we will actually get in the future. We said, we're not going to make you pay it now. We'll abide by your plan to hold us even, but there is some money that's going to accrue to us, and it'll be in the billions of dollars in the future, and we're going to get it, and we're going to insist on getting it. And once we had the Teachers Association and the classified associations on board with us, then the governor followed. I always thought CTA helped write Prop 98. They were essential in that. And once the CTA folks were with us, and we have David Alvarez in the south part of the county, is the chair of the budget subcommittee here in San Diego. He's the chairman of the budget subcommittee for education up in Sacramento. We showed David Alvarez the way sort of this worked, and said, you got to get your colleagues to vote for suspension. In an election year, they thought that was like smacking the school community around, and not a good idea in an election year. And we said, it's with our blessing. So we had organized labor and management together saying, suspend it, and you'll owe us the rest. So I'm telling you that long-winded thing to get to the point of the implications for right now, is that when we now start this fiscal year in July 1, the very first thing we do is we say, for the budget that the legislature adopted, what was the assumption they made about the net ending balance for the state on revenue? And they underestimated June by about, it was over $2 billion. $2 billion more came in than they expected. So going into the new fiscal year, they were already ahead. Then in the month of July, which just last August, we found out what the number was for that, and we've got an update now. Today, we're sitting at $4.3 billion ahead of revenue estimates on what they built the budget on. Well, because of that insistence that we made about the way Prop 98 works, guess who gets all of that money? We do. K-14 education gets all of it. Now, the question is, in the succeeding fiscal months of this fiscal year, next month, the month after, and so forth, does the economy continue to produce money that's over expectation, or do we go the other direction? I mean, you just never know in predicting these things. My prediction is we do probably better than anticipated, and it continues. But even if it doesn't, and we actually held on to the 4.3, The way it'll manifest itself is next January when the governor introduces his budget. He'll say, I'm going to produce a budget that gives us a COLA, which is right now estimated at 2.93%. And believe me, that number could be dramatically less. A year ago when they were proposing the COLA, they thought it was going to be 5% and it'd be 1.07%, just to give you an idea of how it changes. But right now, 2.93%. The governor will propose a budget that tries to fund that, and probably not a whole lot more because he's got systemic problems with the overall budget. But they're going to owe us on a one-time basis that $4.3 billion. That would have to come to us somehow if it was sustained. And it could be a bigger number. And again, depending on the economy, I don't know who gets elected president and the economy tanks, or who knows what happens. Maybe those numbers don't come. But I want to give you the lay of the land as it sits today. $4.3 billion better off than we would otherwise expect, and that has implications for us as an education community. And then the way it flows to us isn't all that helpful, because what the legislature tends to do with one-time money, they can't help themselves, is they'll say, oh, well, we're going to do the Reading Act of 2025, and we're going to name it after one of us. You know, the legislators will find one of them who deserves to have their name attached to it. And then they'll do the reading, and all the money will have strings attached to it, and it won't be able to help us. So one of the things that we want to make sure that we lobby together on, and now is the time to do it when we're already starting this, talking to legislators about, guess what? We'd like you to contemplate, given the fact that we're losing the federal funds that we've had that's one time, we're losing lots of different, there's a cliff effect on lots of different piles of money. You should think about a budget reduction mitigation fund that you would send that money out unrestricted to every district in the state that they could use to help curb some of the cuts they would otherwise make. Now, the thing to note, it's one-time money. Now, again, because it's going to go into Prop 98 and it will have an effect on the base, there's a pretty good percentage of it that actually will be permanent money as well. So it's going to be a mix. But immediately there'll be a 1 year of one-time money, and then ongoing it'll affect the base in the succeeding fiscal year. So there are implications to the way that all works. And the formula doesn't always work that way, that whatever you got in the prior year ends up being the starting point in the next year. Sometimes it's just a straight percentage of the state's general fund. And that's when the general fund is growing by a lot. Getting 40% of the number is better than a prior year kind of formula. And the way the Constitution is written, we get whichever is bigger. So, you know, I love the fact that that prior year guarantee saved us by accident because the legislature gave us too much money, and we would not permit them to undo that, which would have been unconstitutional to let them undo that, with the idea that they're dangling in front of us, but we're going to hold you even and you're not going to get cut at all, so please let us steal your money. It's like, no, it's not going to happen. So that's kind of the genesis of kind of where we are on all that sort of thing. And I just wanted to make sure that you guys know both kind of what the fiscal lay of the land is and why it is that districts are having fiscal stress all up and down the state are mostly issues that are separated from what's happening at the state level. I think there's some opportunity for things to get better in the coming year, marginally better by the state. The question is, are we likely not to have, can we make an assumption that the state doesn't pass a budget or do something at the state level that makes our financial circumstances worse? So I think that the plans and the conversations that you guys are going to have in this room are probably going to move forward with the assumption, not necessarily that we're going to get some giant largesse from the state or big money that's coming, whether it's one time or ongoing, but they probably won't make things worse for us. It probably won't get worse. When I think a year ago, most people would have predicted this is only going to get progressively worse. So, but your circumstances locally as a district with regard to unfunded mandates and declining enrollment and all these other cost pressures you have, there's issues with regard to the cost of insurance. There's issues with regard to the cost of health care, and then sustaining some of the really important things that the legislature has handed school districts to do that are beyond the teaching and learning stuff we do. And that's all the issue about student well-being. Big investments we made. One of the things that's a shame about the federal government and the state sort of giving us a bunch of one-time money and telling us to affirmatively spend this money on things that help kids and well-being and do good things. You do the good things, and what normally would happen is when you prove they work, they write you another check to keep it going. They're not doing that. So you're forced into dismantling great things for kids, which is just not right. But we're put in that position. So sometimes our advocacy maybe needs to shift, not just for hanging on to what we got at the state level, but also putting pressure on them about the things they should feel some obligation to try to continue to support. And it's really important for us to do that work. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I can't remember what's next on the slide, but you get to talk about LCFF. Yeah, so the Prop 98 I tried to cover for you. Let me just see if there's anything else. Yeah, these are all the tests of Prop 98. And then it's you. Yeah, something really exciting. And then just a word about Michael. I don't know if you guys have met Michael, but so essentially the CFO on school, finance and issues for the whole county. So we got 42 districts in this county, right? And so the thing that he does is he has to wear two hats. One is they have a very serious role to provide oversight. The legislature has vested with county offices, and literally him, to have fiscal oversight of districts so that when you get yourself in really deep trouble, he has a shovel in his office and he has to try to help dig you out. And you hope that, the advice and everything on your way keeps you from getting into that kind of problem. But the other part that's really important that they play a real big role in is capacity building and helping us avoid sort of bad situations in districts. And he's really played that role really well of balancing those two things. So the fact that you gave up some time to come and join us and kind of be part of building solutions is super important. So thank you very much, Mike. Yeah. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. And I'll answer questions after.
Well, thank you, Kevin. So let's start with the good news, is that I only have 65 slides. I am going to read every word on every one of them, and we'll have you out of here by 9 o'clock tonight, if that sounds good. No, I have 5 slides today. We're going to look at just the formula that is created, how most school districts, or how school districts receive most of their money, look at how that applies when Poway is run through that formula. We will look at how Poway Unified compares to the other unified school districts in San Diego County, and then a couple of other housekeeping items that also occur down here. And so, Kevin, thank you for that. More? Okay. So, Kevin, thank you for that introduction. I will say, yes, we, at the County Office of Education, we have an oversight role that often gets mistaken with authority to do something. So our primary function is to, review and comment. Things have to get way down the road before we have actually any authority to do something. And when we have the authority to do something, it's not to make you do something, it's to prevent you from doing something. So we only have the ability to stay in action. It's very interesting. And the other important part that we do is, we're a school district. Excuse me. We have about 1,200 students in any given year. We serve the kids who are in the juvenile justice system, so in probation or in the detention centers, and then primarily kids who are expelled, who weren't fitting in the normal setting, and we run the community schools throughout the community to do that. And that's 29 locations across the entire county is where we serve, so the entire county. All right, let me take the temperature here. So Kevin, education is about acronyms. I heard him say ADA, COLA, PERS, STIRS. Did anybody get thrown off with any of those acronyms? Are we all on board? Any refreshers? Okay, then we're gonna have fun today. So what is the local control funding formula? This was created in the 13-14 school year. It was a change. We don't need to go back in time and talk about what happened in 1970, which was a formula we used through 2013, but this became a student demographic funding model, if you will. It didn't create more money in the system. It took all of the old money that was in the system and redistributed it in a different fashion. And this is how it is distributed. So every student is, I don't want to use the word worth, but there is a base grant associated with that child. And that base grant depends on how old kids are. So students in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade, there is one amount for that base grant. 4th through 6th grade, there is another amount. 7th and 8th, there is another base grant. And then 9 through 12 is another base grant. And the easiest way to look at that is that the older the kid is, the more expensive they are to educate. Think about what's going on at high school and the activities and the classes and the 6, 7 period days and stuff. So that base grant goes up as kids get older. But if we go to the adjustments, there's also 2 adjustments in there. So there's an adjustment in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. Everything, we're not going to get into math here, everything is based on a percentage of something. But if districts choose to keep their student-teacher ratio at 24:1 or less in grades kindergarten through 3rd, there's an extra 10% to accomplish that. And the other grade span adjustment is at the high school. It was always called, when it was created, the Career Tech Ed adjustment, the CTE adjustment. However, technically there is no requirement that that's what it gets spent on. So it's up to each district to determine. There's no reporting requirement that goes with that. I think we've seen a huge, in the last 20 years, increase in the understanding and need for Career Tech Ed classes, and a lot of districts do support that. And that's, our agriculture, our building trades, drafting, those types of things. The next thing that goes through this formula is 2 different levels. So now they've identified a grade level that we're going to put a base adjustment to, and now we're going to get into the demographics part of it. So if a student is an English language learner, socially, economically disadvantaged, foster youth, or homeless, the state's vision of the LCFF was that more money should come to support the needs of that particular group of demographics, the historically marginalized. Now, you can be 3 of those things, but you only count once, and that's important. So if you hit one of those categories, that's your 1 count. And then it further goes down to say, we're going to give every student, no matter what percentage of the students who are in your district qualify under this, all of that, from a percentage standpoint, is going to get an additional 20% of your base grant. Then it says, but hang on, if you have a lot of kids, greater than 55% of your total population, then we're going to add another 65% on top of that. So what we're going to see here in the next 2 slides is that there's a discrepancy in the dollar per student, if that's what we want to break it down to, there is from one district to another. So here's how it looks in Poway. You have your base grant, your grade span adjustments, which is kindergarten through 3rd grade, 9th through 12th. Then it factors in the fact that Poway has 20.5% unduplicated count. And again, unduplicated count was that number I talked to about demographics. I worked in Escondido for, a little over 7 years prior to going to the county office, and we were in the 70 percentile in that unduplicated count. So just across a few lines, right, there's a big discrepancy in this student population. We don't need to get into all of the details of everything, but in Poway, when you run it through, and this is the majority of the funding that arrives here, it's just under $400 million is what gets spit out here. Now that is a big general number with no reference point. What does that mean compared to somebody else? Guess what the next one is? Here's how it compares. So when you look at Poway with 20.5%, that averages out to a little less than $11,800 per, and I've been saying per student, but I'm going to say per unit of average daily attendance, so per ADA. We're not funded on how many kids we enroll. We're funded on how many days they're actually here in our seats. And you can see the discrepancy when we get to Oceanside, Vista, San Diego. There's a significant difference between our low unduplicated pupil percentage and our high unduplicated pupil percentage. And good, bad, indifferent, fair, not fair, I'm not here to opine on the merits of the LCFF, But it has created a discrepancy, an intentional discrepancy to provide a greater number of services to, again, what the formula was designed for those specific populations who need more support. And you can see down there, in little writing, if Poway and Oceanside had the same unduplicated pupil percentage, that's almost another $90 million a year in revenue. Not going to get too in deep with this, but that money does come with reporting requirements. Right? It's not just you can do whatever you want with this. There's the Local Control Accountability Plan, the LCAP, that I'm sure a number of you have been involved in, that also comes with spending those dollars and determining actions and services that we're going to target to meet those populations. Just the last two slides here are pretty basic. So the first thing that happens, you run your data through that LCFF formula. It spits out a number. In this case, it was almost $400,000. Then you go look to, well, how much of that is covered in property taxes? And that is the first bucket that gets filled up. It takes all the property taxes that the district is entitled to. And if we're wondering if we can increase that, no, we can't. That is a percentage of some number from the 1970s that is a different percentage in every single school district. You might get 11%, the neighboring district might get 7%. It's one of those fun things about school districts. And then whatever is left, and this is the majority of the districts in the state of California, they still require the state to come in and give you the rest of it to fill your bucket up. But there are a handful of districts, a little over 100 now, I think, who fall into this category, which is their property tax is more than that formula spits out. And in school districts, they get to keep that. So you might see, and in this county, we saw the average for Vista at a little over 13.5. We have districts in this county who are in this basic aid status where it's in the 20,000s of dollars per student. And that's just the reality. Nothing we're going to be able to do about it here tonight. So I think if we were to wrap up with a moral of the story, which is when there are revenue issues, the options to increase your revenue at a school district are basically none. You can get kids to come to class more often, right? So have a greater unit of ADA. This would not be a suggestion. You could lose a bunch of kids where it would fall under and you'd have more property tax than kids, which is not a great move. And that actually so Carlsbad Unified, they flipped in and out of that because of that, right? Their targets came over. So the majority of our revenue, there's not a lot that we can do about it other than with the support of Kevin and the team up there to argue for the things that are important to us. This Prop 98 thing that came out in June was an amazing addition. And with that, I think I'm going to say, are there any questions?
I have two changes to do the question, and I want a couple comments.
Get ready to drop the mic. Sure. Doesn't look like a lively crowd with many questions, but if there are any,
So
we'll be sure to bring
there's
the
a
mic
couple
around.
things that I wanted to kind of reinforce. One of them was the one you just made, because it's really good for us to think about this as a community and sort of the priority for investing in our kids, is that what's happened over time, and this is over decades, communities have increasingly lost control over sort of the destiny of what happens in terms of the investment in kids in schools locally. And I know part of it was the objective to make sure that we're equalizing for non-affluent and affluent communities, because what was going on is that communities that had a whole lot of money had crazy money for their schools, and if you were in a poor community, those kids just got screwed, and you could just see it manifest in the kind of schools that they had and the resources they had available. But one of the really unproductive things about it is this idea, what you talked about, the inability to raise revenue at all. It used to be that school boards, when you were elected, set the tax rate in the community for how much we need to run the school. The board had that authority. And then by the way, it was a majority vote, not of voters, of the board. The board would vote. And if the board ever got to the place where they were enacting taxes that were beyond what voters cared to pay, there would be a new board. They would just throw the rascals out, right? And you had that same symmetry that we have at every level of government. And then the idea of sitting at the collective bargaining table where you as the board control resources and the expenditure resource made sense. Now what we do is we go through that process of collective bargaining and we go through the process of trying to meet the needs of stakeholders in the district with our hands tied behind our back on the revenue part. We have no control. So somebody up there says, here's how much revenue you have, and that's what you got to live with. And the circumstances we have in this district are uniquely bad. I just want to underscore some of the points that you made, where if you watched what Mike was illustrating there, there's two types of districts that have a big advantage over you guys. And that even though Poway was at the top of that chart, the numbers would have put you at the bottom if you were looking at it in descending order of how much money we have to invest per kid in this district. But it's districts with high levels of kids in poverty and English language learners. And God bless them, they ought to get marginally more money. But they do get more money, and you're end up at, probably the lowest level of a lot of the neighbors that he listed on that graphic. And then there's the basic aid districts that are good because they get a lot of local revenue, and they don't have to depend on the state as much, but they got more revenue than any of those people on the chart because they've got local tax revenue. And one of the things, I've been a big defender of basic aid districts over the years because I said, take the highest funded basic aid district in the state and tell me that the revenues that they're spending for their kids isn't a damn good thing. It's a great thing. And that I do not believe in leveling down. That the whole state ought to be doing what we're doing for those kids, right? So the minute the legislature sometimes gets this jaundiced view of basic aid districts, oh, those rich people, but it's like, no, your obligation is you should be pumping in enough money for us all to have those kinds of resources. Because when you look at even the most affluent districts in the state of California compared to the national averages, there's a whole lot of states spending more money than we are, by a lot. So it's really good for you to have the context of the battle the state sets up. They love it when we fight locally with each other because it distracts the fact that they're responsible for the lack of resources that we have. So we always got to be paying attention to. And so one of the things that Greg and the board in this district have said, we want you to focus on, me, when I'm at the Capitol, is that when they have an opportunity where they got a pot of money and they're about to send it out, to try to get policymakers to understand that the local control funding formula already has embedded in it a differential for those districts with high numbers of kids in poverty. That instead of taking the new pot of money that's come to fruition and say, oh, we're going to go ahead and put a criteria on that as well, that we're only spending on poor kids because they want to be for poor kids. And it's like, hold on a second. All districts have base expenditures and needs across the state. And the first thing we ought to do is say, is the base adequate? Are we treating all kids right? And absolutely, if we have marginally more money to give kids that are in poverty, we ought to do that too. But someone's got to give voice to the issues that you guys care about. I was so upset and lobbied up in Sacramento when, in the aftermath of COVID, every chunk of change they found that they wanted to send out to districts, they wanted to do it with a criteria that shorted this district. And you guys had some of the basic needs that every district has. So what did actually come to fruition was a consciousness in the Capitol about base funding. We said, hey, make sure that you pay some attention to base funding because that would help us. And if you pay attention to base funding, if you notice the way he illustrated that chart, when you increase the base, the amount for poor kids is a percentage of the base. All boats rise. Everybody benefits. our base goes up. But when you do what some of the things that Governor Newsom had done, he's proposed pots of money that would bypass every other kid in the state and only send the money to the districts where there's high poverty. It was like, hold on a second. Like, let's not forget everybody. I mean, all kids need marginally some of it, and we get it if you're going to do a little bit more for kids in poverty, but we got to keep conscious. So what I wanted to do is kind of connect the different parts of our presentation to what does that mean we need to be articulating for this district. And I know in future meetings, you guys are going to dig in deeper on kind of the challenges of how do you join a lot of other districts in doing some of the cuts. I will tell you this is real important to know, is that this district did not do the cutting. There are a lot of cuts that have been done, and you guys probably know this, in neighboring districts in other parts of the state. And even layoff notices have been done in certain parts of the state and all kinds of ugliness that's happened. And I think there's been a real commitment to say, look, we want to stave off any kinds of reductions because, again, what I talked about, great programs for kids, we want to do as little of that as possible. But at some point, you do have to sort of start paying attention to what it means to be fiscally solvent. And it's time to pay attention to some of those issues. So now just see if there's any more questions. Craig, you? Yeah.
I'll take Kevin's.
All right, there we go. All right, so could you put the slide back that shows what we get paid per student? Just back it up. There we go. So question for you, Mike. I've heard it said publicly. I've never checked this, and you may not know on the spot, but I would have an interest in knowing, compared to other unified school districts, unified K-12, in the county, where do we sit? What I've heard is we're one of the lowest funded. Is that accurate from your side?
I think this is all unified school districts in the county.
So we are, in fact, the
Yeah.
lowest funded in
Yeah.
the county. Okay. And then the highest basic aid, is it really 20,000? Is it 22,000? Is it 20? Do you have any idea off the top of your head what they get? I'm guessing it's Rancho Santa Fe, but I don't know that just because it's small, 500 students.
The highest this year is about $24,000.
24,000 per student.
But here's a fun one. We do have a district that's closer to $70,000 per year. Okay, they have 37 kids, and so they get additional funding just to keep the doors open.
Okay. This one's for Kevin. Kevin, I have heard you speak on a number of occasions in a lot of different places, here included, and I've never heard you so optimistic about where we sit presently
Right.
and what you're projecting forward. You're really anticipating interest rates coming down, maybe once, maybe twice. You're talking about a $4.3 billion to the good excess, right, in projected revenue. When was the last time we sat in September with a number like 4.3 billion to the positive? Just for historical context, when was the last time that happened?
Yeah, it wasn't long ago. It was just a couple of years ago. In fact, they had a track record of underestimating several years in a row. And then we had last year, because I'm sort of getting used to everything usually being good and big positive numbers at the state level, because they pumped more money into education. Now, one of the things that we've always said, and we said it to this board a few times, is that one of the disappointing parts of the billions, it was billions of dollars they pumped into districts all across the state, is they went into programs with lots of strings attached. Good stuff, but it's like, where's the margin where we get to say, what does the community, this community think is important? They'd already decided it for you. So you'd look at, whether it was ELOP money or whether it's universal meal program, good stuff. I mean, and the list just goes on. There were just tons of things that they had done that racked up billions in new spending. But we did have, I think it was literally the year before last, we had progressively month after month producing more revenue than anticipated. Now, $4.3 billion is a big number. I don't know that it's been probably more than, it probably has been more than at least 5-6 years since we've seen a number like that. It's a bigger than normal number. But I will say, you guys know elections have consequences. And we know that despite all the rhetoric by both sides, that the policies that you'll see that on election day, and I can't even tell you which way it would go, because Wall Street's so fickle. But on the day of the election, depending on who wins, Wall Street is going to react. And we're going to see what their thinking is about what happens, with regard to economic policy in the country, and it could be negative. Mm-hmm. So this year's a little bit different So my optimism is where we sit today, and I really want to qualify that. Where we sit today, it looks really great. I don't know what's going to happen in the ensuing months. But I do, probably the most optimistic statement I'm saying is I don't believe the state will be in a situation to make the challenges you guys have to fix worse. So when you put together your assumptions about what's going to happen at the state level, many districts will say, let's assume a lower than anticipated COLA because they did that to us last year. It went from 5% down to 1.07. Do you really think it'll be 2.93%? And at one point, it was under a percent. So, you know, and I don't know that's going to happen, but I will say that remember that COLA that we get, the cost of living adjustment that we get, is tethered to what they think or what the index says is happening with inflation. But one of the things that all of these things are tied to little formulas, and our COLA is as well. I don't know if you guys know this, that the COLA that we get in K-12 education is tied to an index that doesn't have anything to do with education at all, or California. It's the market basket of goods and services purchased by state governments and local governments across the whole country. And they just say, what are state and local governments paying for stuff? What's the price year over year? And whatever that is the inflation rate we're going to give you school people. I think the index should be changed. My partner doesn't because he wrote the current index, Jack O'Connell. And when he wrote it, it was the best index in the country in terms of giving us more money. But lately, I guarantee if we had an index that reflected the kind of increased costs we have year over year, whether it's the increased obligations we have for kids with disabilities, or it's insurance costs, or it's the STRS-PERS issue, or on and on and on, we'd have a COLA that was way bigger than the COLA that we get. But that's not going to happen. So if you take a look at the COLA that we do have, if it's a measure of inflation, and inflation is now starting to be in check, the number's just going to be a smaller number. And inflation's out of control, it's going to be a big old giant number. So there is a double-edged sword to it. Oh, we want a COLA that's big. Well, that means you have costs that are rising that are big. And it's supposed to be parallel, but it oftentimes isn't. So I just sort of give you that.
No, I do have a correction to make, now that I thought about it. So that is not every unified school district. It is every from an ADA standpoint. So it is missing Mountain Empire. It is missing Borrego Springs, Warner, and Bonsall, all districts with less than 2,000 students, and it would make it impossible to point. The numbers would be more than yours, by the way, but they'd be inflated by something else. What's interesting to me is,
oh, here you go. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is looking at the districts and the investments that they've had with new money in new schools, because we're doing so much with aged school facilities that cost us money that we can't invest in kids, because we're trying to make sure AC works and ceilings stay up. Where these schools, I mean, San Marcos, got a new school every other corner, you know, and they have the new money coming in for all that, but we're at that point where the base needs to be about facility aging and investment there. I mean, that's where.
Yeah, and you might have an opinion too, but I'll share it with you. One of the things, when I started becoming an advocate for public education, I was not involved with school budgets or anything at all, and this is many years ago. But one of the alarming things to me that I was learning that I think everybody sort of kind of learns when you kind of get into it is that separation between capital expenditures and ongoing operational expenditures. That I would look at a district that would be whining about its overall finances and have these gold-plated facilities and think, what's going on here? What are they spending their money on? Well, it's because going to the community and saying we need decent school facilities and having the voters vote in favor of bonds and doing construction is, you could have that happen, but the operational side of the budget is underwater, because when we talk about all these formulas and everything, it's only the operation side of the budget, not the facility side. The facility side is a whole separate part of funding, which is predicated on two major things: One is state bond measures that get passed to help build school facilities, and local bond measures that are passed to match it. And the one thing I always try to get communities to understand, I mean, every good district goes out and tests the sentiment of local voters. And if the sentiment is not there to pass a bond, why go pound your head against a brick wall? If it's marginal or even close, it's worth a campaign. It's worth a conversation with the voters. I always say school facilities are the only infrastructure that we build in this state, massive infrastructure that we build in this state, that's the best bargain for conservative, taxpayer-oriented voters, because it's the only infrastructure where you get a match from the state, from taxpayers in some other community to help you build your schools. So if local voters are willing to put something on the ballot and pass it, they're going to get a match of state money to help you build the facilities you need. And what we see is there are communities, and what's really interesting about this, communities that tend to be less affluent are the ones that, without blinking an eye, pass bonds. Now, you could say it's because they just say, new school? Yeah. And they don't know they actually have to pay for it. But in really affluent conservative communities, it's harder because sometimes the number of kids they actually have in school versus the folks that are retired or otherwise and saying, hey, look, I paid my dues, I'm not doing this. It's just can be harder. But going out and putting something on the ballot and arguing for that, if you think you've got a chance of moving voters, has been made much easier over the last couple of decades. Again, my business partner, who wrote the law that lowered the vote threshold on the passage of bonds from a 2/3 down to 55%. It's easier, but if you're getting polling back from your public that says you can't even get close to that number, it's hard to go to the ballot and waste the energy. And then also there's a consequence when you lose. You don't go intentionally because it's a righteous cause we need to talk about if you know you're going to lose. Because when you do lose, people remember it. So you go to the ballot with great caution, but you need to prep community interest groups, the business community and others to say, look at our facilities. This is a community that should be investing in its facilities more, and we need to participate in that match. So that's my little soapbox on that one. I don't know if you have more to say on facility.
I'll be brief.
Yeah.
That there needs to be a change in the way facilities are funded.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
drastically unfair across the state. And hopefully nobody's in a position where they're forced to have to use the general fund or that LCFF to do school facilities repair.
Right.
That would be,
Yeah.
that'd be horrible.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah.
I understand that the LCFF has been in place about a decade, correctly? Do you have any, or can give us any kind of historical perspective of maybe what funding looked like prior to that, and if it's been a huge detriment to a district like ours, or if it's been kind of similar?
So Kevin served with Governor Reagan, so he knows the full history. I'll let him go into what happened in the 70s.
I've been bathing in pickle juice for a long time, so yeah.
But there is one component of this that didn't allow there to be anyone who got less than they were already getting.
There was a hold harmless.
And that's that ERT. And so, because people did go through the formula, and Poway was one of them, and you look at it and you're like, we have less this year than we did last year. We have the same amount of kids. So they did prop that up. Was it enough? No.
Yeah, they
But
said the idea is nobody loses, so you don't go down below. But I had arguments back when they were doing this that the way it was funded is we had a base rate for everybody, and then you had categories of funding. And you're a district, if you qualified for that money, you got it, and if you didn't, you didn't. But a lot of those formulas were really unfair too, the way they were constructed. It's like on school transportation, it was districts that got in, qualified, and then they said, we're not going to let anybody else apply. And it was like some districts got money and some districts didn't, and there was no rhyme or reason other than the timing of we're done having people be part of the program. And so there was a lot of inequities in category. And so Jerry Brown came along and went, I'm sure people were sitting down with the governor saying, here's how school finance works. And he goes, what are all these programs? And that people could actually get in trouble if you used a pencil that was funded by one program and you discovered that someone was using that pencil in another program because that wasn't from that program. And the governor said, I think we need to just go to a simplified system. Let's just give every kid the same amount of money. and then for poor kids, a marginal amount more was his idea. And they called it a weighted student formula. And then the report or the piece of research that he was globbing onto for that had, I was going to mention this too, because he had talked about how you have what's called an unduplicated count, is they had economic issues, right? People that were in poverty. They had English language learners and foster youth, right? When they did those three things, the people that originally wrote the proposal had you getting more money. Even if you're one kid and you happen to be all three, you got triple the money. You generated triple the amount of money, a base rate student win. They just didn't have enough money to do it. So the governor goes, okay, let's just have $1 amount if they meet any one of the categories, we get it. And that's where that goofy term unduplicated count comes from. It's not a duplicated, there's three ways you can get money. It's not duplicated amongst all three. It's going to be unduplicated. There's going to be a dollar amount you're going to get if you're in poverty. And then, of course, concentrations of poverty. If you have huge concentrations of poverty, then the district gets even more money for that. And the battle we've been fighting is that they keep having this contest in the legislature of who loves poor kids the most. And it's like, we get it. You love poor kids. We want to help poor kids. But you can't forget about the base of education for all kids. And back when we had the setup before, and one of the things that's a dynamic that we face both stakeholders in communities, our important labor partners in management, that when you take a look at the bag of money, if you will, all categorical funding, which is about 1/3 of our money, was considered off the table. It was not sort of subject to collective bargaining. It was just this core thing. Now that we've melded it all together, it's kind of indistinguishable, and it's in some ways has complicated collective bargaining, but it's validated what I used to always argue, which is that there's no such thing as a dollar that's not bargainable, is that everything should be looked at in the context of what are we doing for the whole education family in a community. It should all be part of that narrative. So those are some of the nuances of before, after. But it didn't make what we did in the old days any better, except the experts that wrote those laws were very upset because they used to be famous for being able to explain the old version. And that's about all the difference is. So a lot of people celebrate the reform. I think that when you look at that tower and you tell me that's the simple version, it's pretty laughable. And I had said that to them at the time. I just went, I get where you're headed, but you're never going to make this simple. Because like the governor said, I want it to be the same amount of money. And I said, well, Governor, remember that for high school kids, we've historically always given marginally more money for high school kids because they're more expensive to teach than elementary kids. We got to, okay, let's do that. And then, of course, Governor, you got to make sure that you're making sure that we're paying for whatever cost that in terms of COLA you didn't pay in prior years. You got to make up for that. So we got to have that. Okay, let's do that. And it was just sort of like one thing at a time, and then we got to the, and definitely that's not all my fault, but part of it, of explaining the complexity of it, we got something a little bit more complicated. So, yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's hard to get a microphone away from a lobbyist.
This might sound negative, but the revenues are fixed, and you want to be fiscally solvent, yet you want to be in a position where it's not deficit spending or a school district getting into a deficit state. The oversight is likely at the school district level, and then there's some triggers that happens at the county level. Can you maybe explain how a school district does not get into a deficit scenario?
Yeah. Start by saying there are two types of deficits. There are deficits that you plan for. In other words, we know we have, ESSER's a great example right now, COVID funding. They need to be spent by September 30th, but it might have been money we received 2 years ago. And so while on paper it looks like we're spending more than we received in this year, we're really spending that money from a couple years ago that we had in a reserve. So that's one way. The other way is the structural, right? That's where no matter what, are generally going, well, 85, 90% of the budget is in people, right? So we can look to that. Electricity is just ridiculous. I live in Escondido, and especially in this heat. And so that's what the focus is going to be on, is where of the money we've committed to ongoing, what can we stop doing or change doing or do differently? And then the metrics behind what our oversight is that twice a year districts submit an updated budget. They're called interim reports. And that is a time for a district to either say, hey, we think we've got some problems, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but possibly in the third year, because districts have to do a 3-year budget. And so they could say, hey, we're going to change our status from what's called positive, we think everything's good, to we're going to knock it down a row to qualified, which says, county, we need a little bit more help from you and a little bit more support from you. The other way to do it is we have the authority to look at something and say, no, we're going to downgrade your certification. And it goes all the way down from positive, qualified, to negative. And they mean different things. Positive, you're good in all 3 years. Qualified is things look bad in the third year. And negative is things are bad this year or next year. There's an immediate. And that sets up a different level of support and access that we can provide to districts at that point. So they all mean something different from how we can come in and support. And I'll just say, a lot of what we do nobody knows about, because the CBO will call and say, I'm having problems, how can you help? And we're qualified. And we can sneak somebody in there to provide support and get the stuff done before some of the incidents we've seen down here in the last 10 years. Yeah, so we're trying to get in early and trying to provide support.
So you mentioned how revenue generation is very limited for school districts. So then naturally that turns to cuts or reductions or budget solutions, right? So, but then I remember you guys mentioning earlier about, well, there's some things you can't really touch, either they're mandated or things like that, because a lot of times when we go to our community and we're saying, hey, what are ideas or suggestions? And they're like, well, cut the school lunch program. Easy. We never used to give free lunch to everyone. Can you explain some of those?
No, that's a super great question. And that's actually a really good example. Get this right. The school lunch program is a good example. There are other things. I sat in a district that had huge structural budget deficits, and they were proposing hiring a bunch of people. I was in this boardroom, and a board member went over and said, hold on a second, we're hiring 17 people. We got a structural budget deficit. What the heck are we doing here? It was a stream of money that was going to go to the district. It was like, you can have this. And it was permanent, ongoing money for those positions. It couldn't be used for anything else. Good for kids. We're going to hire them. We got the money to pay for it. The thing's going to be good for kids. But we got the structural deficit, and we can't use it to solve that other problem. So one of the things that we try to explain to legislators is that, do you want them to be able to turn the lights on? Great, you're going to give them the positions, but if we can't even open the doors, it's like you got to, and that's that argument about you got to pay attention to the base, the general fiscal health of the district, and then fund those things. But it was a big urban district, and it was like this it just was such an obvious example of what you're talking about. Child nutrition program is a great example, because I remember being around when the Great Recession happened and districts wanted to try to save money, and every really creative chief business official in the school district was saying, well, gosh, we have these giant reserves in these school nutrition programs. Maybe there's something we can do. Well, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is the one that sort of runs that program nationally, and then they have a division. I call the California Department of Education the United States Department of California Education, because so much of their money comes from the feds. This crazy amount of money that makes CDE, the California Department of Ed, run comes from the federal government. And it's the obligation of CDE to be the federal government's agent in oversight. And they've got a whole team of people on child nutrition who are watching every move a district makes relative to this very, very strict use of those dollars. And so we would always be in budget workshops that we do for districts saying, be careful about messing with child nutrition dollars, because not only will you have to put whatever money it is you're kind of siphoning off for whatever reason, but there are penalties involved that are big. And you don't want to mess with that. But it's a great example of, now we're going to feed all kids, but can we afford to give the kids the counselors or some of the other well-being issues that we paid attention to that we desperately need to do? And that's the way those things are siloed. It's really frustrating, but it really is. There's a lot of ways, and states have that and counties have that. The state of California, their budget committee would talk about things that they would cut to try to balance the state's budget. And they said, just so you know, if we cut this, we will lose triple the funding in federal dollars for some program. You know, I would hear in budget hearings that. It's like, so okay, then we're not cutting that. And it was just, you know, some of these really interesting dilemmas that we have when we do budgeting.
Yeah, and I think, so the key takeaway is that that is going to be unique to every district. What goes on here might not be what goes on up the road, which is why I think it's a tremendous idea to have this advisory committee together to get everybody's idea, because it's about what's important to the community and what's important to the Poway Unified School District. So, and I mean, I probably give a real quick example. So Mountain Empire has 1,200 kids. They have 664 square miles, the largest territory in San Diego. They spend roughly 8% of their entire budget, unrestricted budget, on transporting kids. So kids spend 5-6 hours on a bus every day just to get to school. So if somebody went into their advisory committee and said, hey, we need to spend less on transportation, that's a no-go in that community, because then kids could never get to school, right? So the circumstances are unique in every place that you go. There is not a magic bullet. And I would just encourage to explore all ideas and have those conversations about tolerance and what's important and what is less important. Everything's important, but some things are more than others.
Any other questions? Yeah, oh, there you go. Since I'm not going to relinquish mine.
So there's about another, I guess, 106, maybe 116 million of revenue from, 4 other buckets here. You got the federal revenues, the state revenues, local, and the other sources. Could you, on top of that, right, you're just talking about the LCFF. So could you talk generally about the formulas for those? What are the, percentages or whatever, I guess, most specifically the state revenues? That's probably your expertise, but
Yeah.
I'd love to.
So like on federal revenues, I mean, we just generally sort of thumbnailing it. It tends to be, and I don't know, you're going to know, Greg's going to know, or his team's going to know what it is for this district. And you'll get into that probably more in the next meeting. But the general rule of thumb is about 10% of your overall revenues comes from federal sources. Now in this district, it's probably less, because again, the federal government likes sending out money for poor kids. So to the degree that you have less of that than San Diego Unified, you're going to get less of that money. And again, a lot of it does come with strings attached too. Federal money does tend to have a lot of strings attached. And then when you think about that federal bucket, that actually is inclusive of the child nutrition program. And one of the things I was always frustrated with the child nutrition program is the state had all these mandates about what we were expected to do for our kids in terms of school meals, that they would dictate above what the federal standard was, and they were never willing to pay for it until really the legislature and this governor in the last few years said, not only do we need to pay for what our obligation is, but we need to make sure it's for all kids. He basically beat, the federal government has been talking about universal meals forever, and he beat them to the punch by doing that in California, which I think is a good thing. But it's part of that sort of dynamic. So about 10% there. There's also, it's not part of this, but there are lottery revenues we get, and we get that question all the time. And it's one that I imagine school board members get all the time. What are you doing with all that lottery money? And the lottery money it's about, I don't know, it's maybe a couple $2 billion. In the context of the overall school funding in the state of California, it's kind of a drop in the bucket. But one of the things I always like to remind people about, when the Lottery Act got passed, we had this major budget problem the year afterwards. And there was nothing in the Lottery Act that prevented what the legislature did, was to cut the state support for schools by an identical amount. So then it was like, so basically it was a zero-sum game. Now, what I've always said to the lottery director and the people that are around the lottery now is, would we be upset if they take lottery money away from us? Oh, heck yeah, because we're dependent on that revenue for a lot of the stuff that we get in terms of revenue. But it ended up being taken away as a supplement to us because of the way they engineered the financing way back when they started the lottery. It's just really a bummer. And again, it is a very small part of the overall education funding. The dominant part is LCFF is just this huge percentage. I think it's over 70% of the money that we get is the LCFF piece. So, but it's real important to note there are other streams of revenue that school districts do get.
I would say if the form you're looking at there is at the top says restricted and unrestricted funding, those two major components of that's going to be special education from the federal government, food from the federal government, special education from the state portion, and the food from the state portion are going to be the majority of those, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And the title programs.
And then just to put a point on the special ed piece, the board here in the district has been really vocal about advocating for full funding of special ed, which was promised back in 1974, has never been done. And it was to get to the Fed's share being 40%, and I don't think it's ever been more than 15%, and now it's probably around 8 or 9%.
10. I was going to say it's
Yeah.
always close to 10.
Yeah, so it's not an impressive number, and sort of, again, depending on what happens with the election, it's an issue that we raise, but where we might actually get something done. There's no question that in the new leadership of Congress, depending on the outcome of the election, there are those who want to really cut back federal funding because federal government's spending a lot of money on a lot of things. But there's also the potential that if Democrats end up taking control in a powerful way in Congress, they will throw a lot of money around on special ed. It has been President Biden's objective, and he hasn't gotten it any of the years because he's had divided Congress to fully fund special ed. The first president since 1974 to propose full funding of special ed. But we got a lot of major Republican allies in the U.S. Senate and other places who believe in it, just not enough votes to actually get us there. Spending cuts on the Republican side of the aisle are more popular amongst that constituency than investing in special ed. But it is the bill, there's the bill that does that full funding on special ed. It's got 40 Republican co-authors. So there are a lot of Republicans who believe in it, just not enough to make a difference in the vote threshold when we get there. So.
And the importance of that is if the federal government not funding their 40%, the state's not picking that up.
Correct.
The local school district is.
It's
So
all
that's
falling on
the
the
importance
district.
of
Yep.
getting that fully funded.
Very good. Anything else? Yeah. You want to, here.
Chuck.
Yeah, I'll throw it at you. There you go.
Thank you. One of the, I think, unintended outcomes of the universal meal program is that it's been more challenging to get families to complete the free and reduced meal application. And things are impacted, like some of our title funding and our LCFF supplemental funding. Is there any advocacy being done at the state level to find other ways to do income verification that would benefit a district like ours?
Yeah, I will just state that question differently. So in the unduplicated count where it's socially economically disadvantaged, that means qualifies for free and reduced lunch. That is the metric for that. And since they've now said every kid can get a free meal, less families are filling out that form, which means less kids are qualifying. That was the impact of that, but let me.
No, and so to expand on your point, is that means we're not just losing money on the school lunch program, we're losing money in everything. Well, it was really your point.
And a lot of the COVID funding was dependent on
Right.
your Title I allocation,
Right.
and your Title I allocation is dependent on your free and reduced meal
Right.
program. So it has
So
a trickle effect.
It's kind of an attention span issue sometime at the Capitol building where we get into the budget process, and some of you guys know there are things called trailer bills. So there's the base bill that holds the budget proposal, and then everybody's wild idea that may cost a little money, they tuck into places, and they end up getting a package of 25 bills. And the education trailer bills, usually there's at least 2 or 3 of those, where there are all these swell ideas. And of course, people like me are running around trying to get stuff inserted in there to get some traction on it. And one of the issues that we had language and it just hasn't gone, and I think it's again an attention span of policymakers about we're dealing with all of these sort of righteous causes, and the one that says, hey, we need to do something about this, where they've actually had proposals, but they're sort of grappling with how do you validate that? And so one of them was going to be basically at income poverty level. Well, that means now we're asking families about their income. And it's like, how do you extract that kind of information? So one of the things a lot of districts are doing is they're changing the name of the form. So it's like a community engagement form or some kind of or academic engagement or something, where they go to this different style of form that they want families to fill out. And what they're saying to families is that if you fill this out, it will benefit the school district to have more resources for all kids, including yours. And if we can change that dynamic so they understand it, we might get more people. But they've had different ideas for an index to replace it. But they got to do something, because we're continuing to see the slide and the impact that's happening as more and more families realize there's universal meal programs, and why am I filling out this form? It's a great question. All right, anybody else have one to stump us with? No? Okay. All right, I'm closer to him. He gets my mic. Here you go.
So I know this room well. We love a meeting that starts on time and ends early. Can I get an amen? So I opened by acknowledging some of the VIPs in this room, our school board members and Kelly Logan, and appreciate you guys and your leadership. I also, in closing, I want to recognize our VIPs, the teachers who were in the classroom all day. You're here, so thank you. Our PFT leadership is here, thank you. Our principals are here. We have directors here. You all, many of you worked a long day. We have parents here, and community leaders, and yes, council member, thank you. Were you here in the beginning? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed you. There we go. Well, and so anyways, I want to thank each of you that made this a priority, cabinet, for being here and a part of this conversation. This is the beginning. I want to thank our presenters, Kevin and Mike. Can we give them a round of applause, please? I mean, you wouldn't know this, but these guys command a big audience in lots of places, keynotes in right environments that hold hundreds, sometimes thousands, and so that you're here and making our little district a priority and sharing your time with us is greatly appreciated, so thank you. We meet again. I'm going to slide back here to the very beginning slides. Almost. There we go. We're going to meet again on October 8th, and at that time we'll have an opportunity to hear from our staff an update on our budget, right? So we'll do a deep dive on where POWA Unified sits, what's looking promising, what's concerning, and what we'll be monitoring now and forward with great interest. And so I hope you'll come back and be a part of that conversation, and then we'll have more information at that meeting about future dates, some potential opportunities for us to interact on this topic. Any questions for me before we close? Okay, I'm going to get you home in time for, I hear there's a debate, right? Or a back to school night or whatever it is you're doing. Have a great night, you guys. Thank you for joining us.